Hello and welcome to another episode of Pod to Profit. I'm Abby.
I'm Liz.
And today we are going to be talking about the perfect podcast formula, scripting and structuring for maximum engagement.
Today's focus, we're going to talk about structure and script to keep listeners engaged from start to finish. So why does it matter? Coming from two squirrel-brained ADHD podcasters, it matters, okay? So we try to stick to a formula. It doesn't always happen. If you go back to some of my early episodes, they are so cringy. Sometimes I go off on tangents, but it's authentic when you're passionate about what you care about. It's okay. You also don't want to completely stick to a script, otherwise it's boring. But really
like
having
our trailer episode's perfect example of that. We read our script and then we're like, okay, now let's actually talk.
That was weird. That was weird.
And I thought it turned out
literally
good,
there was
though.
like a pause. We're like, okay, Abby, that was weird. Like we literally read a script. But structure really matters because it helps your listeners follow along and stay engaged. And it prevents that rambling or losing focus, making your episodes just a lot more polished and professional.
And it makes it easier to edit. Like when you're not doing the rambles that need to be cut out, like that makes it easier for whoever's editing your show.
Yeah, well, I feel like whatever.
You've gotten better. Your listener's journey is a big part of this too. So people listened for value, whether it's to be entertained, education, inspiration. You're here listening to this because you want to know how to make a profitable podcast. And that's what we need to focus on when we're making these episodes.
So a strong structure is going to ensure that you get that value without shutting us off halfway through. So the perfect podcast episode formula. First of all, you're going to want a hook. So a strong hook to grab attention. So some sort of fact or a question or a quick story, or basically what is in it for you? What are you going to learn or gain by listening? I talk about it all the time. My time is my most valuable possession. And I mean possession because I own my time. I get to decide how I spend it. If I am listening to an episode and if it turns me off in the first minute or two, done. Nope, moving on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And then we get into your introduction. Now, this is how you introduce yourself and the episode topic. For us, it's saying hi. We have a pre-recorded introduction as well. And I am personally a huge fan of a pre-recorded introduction because I like to play podcast karaoke. So with all of my podcasts that I listen to for fun, they all have pre-recorded intros so I can say it along with the people as I'm like listening in the car. And I get a lot of joy out of that. So I really encourage people to do that because I like it personally.
In the first couple minutes, make sure you tell them what the topic is going to be. If you have a guest, introduce them, and then just share like a quick personal anecdote or somehow tie it to the topic and your audience's pain point. So for example, I always tie the topic back to something my audience is experiencing. So struggling with, Q4 marketing or whatever it might be, struggling with like holiday season, keeping shoppers, engaged in buying with your subscriptions, or, in the springtime, it's tulip season, just tie it back to something that I know that they're going to be experiencing.
And then we get into your core content, the bulk of what the episode is about. So you're breaking that main topic down into 3 to 5 segments or key points or takeaways that you really want to drive home with your audience. You're going to want to use some clear transitions between those points to keep it organized, whether that is a physically saying, okay, we're moving on to the next thing, or maybe you have an ad break there and you kind of break it up with some sponsored ads that you have to insert into your show. That's a really good way to do that.
Yeah, and I think that another thing to keep your listeners following along, I've done this on a few episodes. Again, we're just experimenting. This whole thing is just one big experiment. But one episode that I feel like was really well received was a tax planning episode for farmers. And at the end, I said, all right, here's 10 tips and takeaways. And I listed and explained out 10 different things. For whatever reason, that format, people were like, wow, your episode sounded great. I'm like, all I did was numbered things but whatever. You even said, you were like, I loved that. I'm like, okay.
Numbers are comfortable though.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you're moving through something like, hey, here's 10 tips or 5 takeaways or whatever. Number 1, number 2. And then your audience is engaged and they're actually following along.
The Babies on Broadway podcast, Rolling in the Deep, they do a great job of, at the end, they're like, what are our actionable takeaways from this? Like
Yes.
they clearly state it, and then the audience has it. Another thing that you can add in that kind of core area is an engagement moment. This can happen kind of in the middle or at the end. If it's natural in the middle, I say put it in the middle, but it's ask a rhetorical question, invite listeners to reflect on what has been shared, and then mention free resources and ask them to follow and subscribe. We have countless free resources at this point for you guys. And if you listen to these episodes, we always mention head to the show notes, check them out, download them, give them a step to follow.
Yep. And then, focusing on that call to action at the very end. So a very clear summary of the episode, reinforce those key takeaways, and then direct them to an action. Tell them, make sure you subscribe, make sure you leave a review, make sure you follow us on social media, make sure you download a resource. I will say, the outro, keep it short and sweet. Usually it's a canned something that you keep putting over and over again. If I have a specific new download, the only complaint I have is sometimes I'll just click out before someone leaves an outro because I know what they're going to say. And so if you have something new that you really want to make sure that they're in there, rather than like, make sure you subscribe and rate us and blah, 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 leave a review. Before that comes, say, hey, I know that in the outro, I'm going to tell you to subscribe and rate us, but make sure that you rate us. Thanks, guys. Like,
Catch their attention. It's always fun. If you do stick around for those outros, there are hidden things. Like at the end of yours, you have Vidalia. When we first started the podcast, she was like so into like what we were doing.
Yes, and she still is.
She's still into it. But she sang a little flower song and then gave your website. So then like we can put that in as like an Easter egg at the end for everyone to hear her teeny tiny little voice singing her flower song.
She is not the same anymore. She's
No.
7 now. And it like that was 2 years ago almost, or a year and a half ago. And her voice is so different now. She was 5.5 there.
With her little light up kitty headphones.
Yeah, flowers, we love flowers. Meadow, they smell so good. honeymarymeadow.com.
So it's worth it to stick around for the outro. And if your audience knows that there's something cute or in it for them at the end, like they'll stick around for it.
Yes. So then, make sure you are scripting to try to just have maximum engagement. So you're going to do your outline and then script. So start with a loose outline to organize your thoughts, and then script those parts like the hook, the intro, the call to action. You want it to sound loose and natural.
And then write like you talk. If you don't use big words, don't write big words. Talk like you are you, because your audience can sniff out when you're not being authentic.
Yeah. Make sure that you avoid that overly polished language. You want to keep it conversational. You want it to sound like you're having a conversation. So you can say things like, here's the thing, or you know what I mean? And pretend like they're listening.
Mm-hmm. And then use visual cues in your script as well. Bold, underline, italics, whatever is going to be like good for you as you're looking at your outline. Like type those visual cues in, highlight what you need to, do what you got to do to keep that conversation flowing, because your audience isn't seeing your script. If you're watching the video version, you guys can't see what we're looking at.
Exactly. And make sure you practice, but don't over rehearse it, because then it sounds really canned. So kind of glance through your script a few times, but leave room for spontaneity. And there you go. I just fumbled on words. I was like, glance script, that's okay. Like it doesn't have to be perfect. And, another tip that I'll give, I'll be honest, right now I'm realizing as we're doing this, it's fine, but I don't love sitting down in these chairs. I think that's what's felt unnatural for me.
Your chair has 2 legs and it's positioned on top of a step stool.
Well, shut up. We needed matching green chairs for this video. I record standing up.
Yeah.
And I record at my sit-to-stand desk, and I just feel like that helps me when I record standing up. So I don't know. Find what is going to make you feel the most confident. We've got this gold sequin curtain, whatever, but Abby's making me sit down.
I have a great example of this, actually. So I've used her as an example before on the podcast, the Megan May podcast. We just broke out of this like this past summer. Every single episode, she wrote out word for word and read the script. It needed to be perfect. Word for word, read the script on her phone. And finally, I'm like, Megan, we're going to try something. Put the phone down. Lock the screen. Tell me what you wrote. She's never gone back. She completely, now she has her outline, now she has her ideas, now she has her topics. But we broke the script reading. It took a while, but once we did, it has completely changed the sound of her podcast.
Yeah, and you can tell when things are scripted. You can tell. I mean, honestly, we're reading key points here, but that's okay too. I would rather have, yesterday I gave a keynote speech spontaneously to over 700 people at the Minnesota State FFA LDE conference. So it used to be the state convention, and now they've broken it into two pieces. But their main keynote speaker, I was judging a few topics. Speaking, I was judging prepared public speaking and creed speaking. And last minute, they asked me to give a speech. And I'm like, well, okay, I've got 2 hours to prepare for this. I need to cut it down to 15 minutes. I need to make it relatable to high schoolers. All right, well, I am going to be using my notes. I'm going to be following a script because I cannot wing it and stand up there and risk rambling. And so I shared. I said, hey, feel free to roast me as I judged you all morning for speaking. But here's my scenario. I had 2 hours to prepare for this. Sometimes it's okay to use note cards or a script because I would rather have note cards or a script and use that to collect yourself than not have something to look back on and then freak out. So just, whatever is going to make you feel more comfortable, naturally I get off the script and that's okay.
So moving on to creative segment ideas to keep your listeners engaged. One thing that works really well, this is actually like a tip from ye old radio days when I was a radio DJ, recurring segments, something that is familiar. People like hearing the same thing, not like the same thing, but the same general ideas. So Q&A, listener submitted questions, sharing quick tips at the end of the episode, a peek behind the scenes. We actually like radio, like War of the Roses is a big thing with KDWB down in the cities. It's the same like listener relationship problems, but people have been tuning in for decades.
Yep. And then another thing is incorporating storytelling. So start with a short story that ties to the topic. So an example, something that you tried, I tried X and Y happened. Keep them engaged. They don't want to be lectured at, they want to be entertained. Ultimately, no one wants to be lectured at.
Using teasers is a great way to keep people engaged as well. So if you hint at something at the top of the episode, if your hook is a teaser and you don't really get to that specific thing until like halfway through, people are going to wait until they hear it. Like they want to know, they want that closure.
Yep. And then make sure you engage your audience directly. Saying things like, have you ever felt? I know I have. So just invite people to share things on social media, but try to just talk directly to one person. I think that's been really helpful for me rather than, hey, everyone, hey, guys. And I do it sometimes in my stories on social media, because otherwise that sounds really weird. I'm like, hey, you. And then like, that's weird. But when
She knows I'm looking at her stories.
Exactly. But when you're doing a podcast, just try to pretend like you're talking to one person, because that's who you want to resonate really deeply with.
So let's get into some examples. Your approach with Flower Farmer Forum, what's kind of your...
So I try to start with a bit of a personal story to set the tone that's going to be related to the topic. And then I use a lot of, lists of tips or lessons for the main content. And honestly, like really self-deprecating, like just make fun of myself. Like, hey, don't be an idiot and do what I did. Do it this way. Because that's the whole reason that they're listening, is they're trying to get a shortcut of running their business or growing flowers or whatever it might be. So a lot of it is, hey, this is what I used to do, and this is why it didn't work, but this is what I do now and it works better, and this is what you should do because it's really expensive or time consuming to do what I did at first. And just kind of directing listeners to then my other free downloads or my courses or whatever it might be, just for more helpful tips.
So some takeaways here is structuring your episodes with a strong hook, clear segments, and memorable conclusions. Like kind of have a rough idea of what you want to do with that episode before you even hit the record button. 2 on the takeaways.
Okay. And then make sure you really write your script strategically. Don't overdo it, but kind of prepare for those key moments.
Incorporating creative segments to keep your listeners week after week is great. Think of like some things that you could do. Like, what could I do every week? Like, can I give them like a cute little name for like my takeaway segment? Like, think of something that they're going to be triggered in their head. Like, oh yeah, she did that last week. Oh, she did that the week before.
But ultimately, keep it conversational and keep it authentic. Your personality is your podcast's biggest asset. Last year, when I hosted the first ever Flower Farmer Forum conference, Sarah gave me the best compliment, honestly. She came up to me, I was in the bathroom and washed my hands, and she comes up to me and she's like, Liz, I just want you to know that everyone here, I've heard them say the same thing. They are so glad, not surprised, but glad that you are the same. You're the same on your podcast. You're the same in person. You're the same in social media. None of it is fake. It is authentically you. And we feel like we know you. And that's why we trust you to put on these courses.
Showing up as your authentic self will take you a long way, no matter what you're doing.